A woman is alone in her home. A stranger knocks. Within minutes, she'll be fighting for her life on her own kitchen floor, a gun pressed to her stomach, a hand around her throat. She doesn't know it yet, but the man attacking her isn't just a predator. Police will later say he could be one of the most prolific serial killers most of America has never heard of. She survives. He doesn't. And what detectives find in his car afterward will send a shockwave through law enforcement in more than 20 states. This is the story of Heather Saul, the woman whose fight for her own life may have ended someone else's killing spree for good. Charleston, West Virginia, summer 2015. A quiet residential block on 6th Street, the kind of neighborhood where a scream would actually get noticed. Heather Saul was 28 years old. She worked as a sex worker, advertising her services online, the way thousands of independent workers did at the time, on sites like Backpage. It's a detail worth sitting with, because it's part of what made her, in the eyes of the man who came to her door, an easy target. Sex workers are disproportionately targeted by predators, specifically because attackers assume no one will come looking. That assumption is about to be proven catastrophically wrong. On July 18th, a man calling himself Al arranged to meet her. His real name was Neil Falls, 45 years old, originally from Eugene, Oregon. On paper, he looked unremarkable, a drifter with a background in private security work, recently unmoored by his mother's death and a broken relationship. In reality, investigators would come to believe he'd spent over a decade slipping through the cracks of the American justice system, stopped by police in more than 20 states, and never once seriously charged with anything. Heather didn't know any of that. All she knew was a client was coming to her home. She had no idea a car was parked nearby loaded with tools that had nothing to do with sex work, and everything to do with murder. Before we go back to that afternoon on 6th Street, you need to understand something true crime rarely spells out clearly. Predators don't pick victims at random. They calculate risk. And for decades, one group of women has consistently ranked, in the eyes of serial offenders, as the lowest risk target in America: sex workers. It's not conjecture. Researchers who study prostitution-related homicide in the U.S. have found that female sex workers face a dramatically higher homicide rate than almost any other occupation in the country, and one widely cited public health estimate puts the number at roughly 17 times the homicide rate of the general population. 17 times. That number isn't an accident. It's a feature of how these crimes work. Advocates who work directly with sex workers have said it plainly for years. Predators openly admit they target sex workers specifically because they're people who won't report the crime, people they assume no one else is watching out for. That's not a fringe theory. It's a documented pattern echoed across some of the most infamous serial murder cases in American history. Gary Ridgway, the Green River Killer, confessed to murdering dozens of women, many of them sex workers, and told investigators he chose them because he believed they could disappear without anyone noticing right away. The Long Island serial killer, still only partially identified, is believed to have killed at least 10 women connected to the sex trade over more than a decade. Across the Atlantic, 5 sex workers were murdered in Ipswich, England, in just a few months in 2006. Go back even further, and you land on the case that arguably started the entire conversation: Jack the Ripper, killing sex workers in London in 1888, betting correctly that the era's police and press would barely blink. This is the pattern Neil Falls was stepping into, not a one-off crime of opportunity, a well-worn playbook. In 2015, the platform Heather used to advertise, Backpage, was one of the largest of its kind in the country. For sex workers, it offered something the street never could: the ability to screen clients, work indoors, and reduce risk. But it also created something else: a public directory that made it dangerously easy for someone like Falls to browse, select, and plan. 3 years after Falls' attack, in 2018, the U.S. Department of Justice seized Backpage entirely, shutting it down amid a sweeping federal case alleging the site had knowingly facilitated trafficking and exploitation. Whatever your view on that shutdown, one thing became clear in its aftermath: the same searchable convenience that helped sex workers manage risk was, for men like Falls, a hunting ground. Here's the part that should genuinely unsettle you. Even before Falls ever pulled into Heather's neighborhood, he had already been stopped by police more than 20 times, across more than a dozen states. Traffic stops, routine checks, every single one, he walked away clean. Nobody connects those dots in real time. There's no national alert that fires when the same man gets pulled over in Oregon, then Texas, then Kentucky, then West Virginia, carrying a car full of restraints and blades. The system isn't built to see a pattern pattern until there's already a body, or in this case, until there's almost one more. So by the time Neil Falls knocked on Heather Saul's door on July 18, 2015, he wasn't a first-time offender testing the waters. Based on everything investigators would later piece together, he was very possibly a man with years of practice, arriving at what he had every reason to believe would be another quiet, unreported disappearance. He had done the math. He believed the odds were in his favor. He was wrong. Let's go back to that afternoon. Falls arrived at Heather's door that afternoon. The moment she let him in, everything changed. He pressed a gun into her stomach and gave her two options. In his own words, live or die. What followed was a 10 to 15-minute struggle for her life. He wrapped his hands around her throat, telling her to stay quiet, dragging her through her own home while she begged to breathe. She would later describe an unnerving detail that stuck with investigators. How practiced he seemed, controlled, like a man who had done this before. As he pulled her into the kitchen, she spotted an opening, a rake within reach. She grabbed for it. For a split second, his grip loosened as he tried to wrestle it away from her. That was the moment. Heather got a hand on his gun and fired it behind her, barely believing it would even go off. It did. Neil Falls was pronounced dead at the scene. A neighbor found Heather outside minutes later, pacing, injured, in shock, and called 911. Officers arrived to a case that looked, on its face, like a clear act of self-defense. They had no idea they were about to uncover something much bigger. Police searched Falls' vehicle, and what they found turned a self-defense shooting into a nationwide manhunt for answers. Inside the car, multiple axes, a shovel, bleach, a bulletproof vest, handcuffs, knives, a machete. To investigators, it read like exactly what it looked like, a kill kit. Built and maintained by someone prepared to abduct, harm, and dispose of a victim without leaving a trace. In his pocket, they found something even more chilling, a handwritten note listing the names, ages, and phone numbers of 6 other sex workers who advertised on the same platform Heather used. Detectives scrambled to track every one of them down. Thankfully, all 6 were found alive and safe, one as far away as San Diego. But the bigger question was already forming. If this was his kit, and this was his method, how many times had he already succeeded? Charleston detectives brought in the FBI. Falls' documented movement across the country, Oregon, Nevada, Indiana, Kentucky, Texas, didn't look like a drifter's aimless wandering anymore. It looked like a hunting pattern. To understand what detectives were suddenly staring down, you have to go back further. Falls was born in 1969 in Eugene, Oregon, into a large, impoverished family, one of 10 children. Friends and acquaintances over the years described him inconsistently. He developed an early fascination with firearms. In 2008, he lost a security job following allegations of sexual harassment, and from that point on, his life became a pattern of near-constant relocation. That pattern is one of the eeriest parts of this case. Between 2009 and 2015, Falls moved through Oregon, Indiana, Kentucky, and Texas. Police pulled him over for minor violations more than 24 times across the country. Every single time, he walked away. No red flags ever stuck. It's a sobering reminder of how easily someone can move through the system when nothing forces a deeper look. Here's where the story turns from unsettling to genuinely disturbing. Between 2003 and 2007, Falls lived in Nevada. During that same window, several sex workers in the area vanished. 3 of them were later found dismembered, their remains discovered not just in Nevada, but scattered across California and Illinois. Every one of those women, like Heather, had advertised their work online. Investigators couldn't ignore the pattern. A man with a documented obsession with control, a car built for abduction and disposal, and a personal history overlapping almost exactly with a string of unsolved dismemberment murders. Investigators didn't stop at Nevada. In 2014, just 1 year before Heather's attack, a wave of disappearances hit Chillicothe, Ohio, a small city roughly a 2-hour drive from Charleston. A dozen women vanished from the area, many of them also connected to sex work. To this day, most of those cases remain unsolved. Falls' movements placed him plausibly within reach of the timeline and geography. Investigators flagged the overlap. It was never conclusively proven, but it was close enough, recent enough, and consistent enough with his pattern that it couldn't be dismissed either. By 2018, Falls' name had been raised in connection with an even older, more infamous case, the so-called I-70 killer, responsible for a string of unsolved murders across the Midwest years earlier. Investigators tested possible links. Nothing definitive ever surfaced publicly connecting him to those specific crimes, but the fact that his name came up at all tells you how seriously law enforcement had come to treat him as a suspect with reach far beyond one state, one city, or one victim. This is maybe the most important and most frustrating part of the story. Falls wasn't hiding in the shadows. He had a job history, a driver's license, traffic stops on record in over 20 states. He existed, visibly, in the system for years. What let him slip through wasn't invisibility. It was the fact that his victims, largely sex workers, were exactly the population predators have historically known how to target with the least risk of consequence. Advocates who work with sex workers have said for years that this vulnerability isn't accidental, it's exploited. Neil Falls's case became a grim, high-profile illustration of exactly that argument. For everything Falls seemed to plan, the kit, the note, the pattern of targeting women he assumed wouldn't be missed, he made exactly one fatal miscalculation. He didn't plan for Heather Saul to fight back the way she did. He didn't plan for a rake within arm's reach, or for a woman who, in her own words, had spent a lifetime learning how to fight. That single miscalculation is very possibly the only reason this story doesn't end with her name on a missing persons list instead of on the news. There was no trial in the traditional sense, because there was no defendant left to try. Prosecutors reviewed the shooting and determined almost immediately that Heather had acted in clear self-defense. She was never charged with a crime. Instead, the investigation shifted entirely onto the dead man. Detectives and the FBI spent months, then years, trying to determine exactly how many victims Neil Falls may have left behind. Some estimates floated by investigators at the time suggested he could be linked to as many as 10 deaths, though many of those connections remain suspected rather than definitively proven to this day. Several of the disappearances he's been tied to, including the Chillicothe cases, remain officially unsolved. Law enforcement was, however, unequivocal about one thing. They credited Heather Saul with stopping an active threat. Detectives publicly called it a textbook case of a potential serial killer being taken off the street, not by a task force, not by a break in forensic evidence, but by the woman he chose as his next victim. Heather Saul went from being a woman fighting for her own survival to, almost overnight, a symbol held up by police and press alike as proof that one person's split-second instinct to fight can ripple outward and protect people she'll never meet. If this case moved you, sat with you, or made you think differently about how we protect the most vulnerable people in our communities, that's exactly why we tell these stories. Subscribe to The Final Statement so you don't miss the next one. Drop a comment with your thoughts on this case. I read every single one, and if you know someone who'd find this case as unsettling and important as you just did, share it with them. These stories deserve to be heard.